Well, good morning. I think all of you in the audience today have been here to previous sessions, so we welcome you back to the next exciting talk. This time we're having one of our graduate students here at Eastern present on architecture, and I will want to thank him for his work by presenting him with the certificate here.
Thank you.
David Finnigan, and I also want to congratulate you on the recent publication of your book
Yes.
on computers. So I will ask Dr. Wabi to present, I think, his student.
Thank you all for coming. Actually, David Finnigan is one of my best students. He is a thorough researcher, and he is an author also, published author. And I don't know if you're still undergraduate, right?
Yes, still
So
undergraduate.
next year you'll be graduate, and we'll look for Dr. Finnigan soon.
Yes.
You'll love his research, and without much ado, here is David.
Thank you. All right. Today's topic is ancient Greek architecture, and just a brief outline of what I'm going to cover. Because it's such a broad subject area, I decided to focus on first the history. Then we're going to talk about a number of architectural terms for the forms and features. Then a few examples of Greek temples and palaces. And then finally, I'll talk about how Greek architecture is still around us today in neoclassicism and the Greek revival styles. I had a lot of success with researching the material for this from 3 books that I found from the library here. And the first one was Classical Architecture, The Poetics of Order by Alexander Zonis and Leon Lefebvre. That really helped out with a lot of the temples and palaces, and it had a lot of pictures. And a lot of the history came from the book called Classical Architecture by James S. Curl. And then the third book was The Architecture of Ancient Greece by William B. Dinsmore. And so those were the 3 books that I relied on the most in preparing this presentation. Now, to start off, let's talk about the history, because obviously all this stuff was built many centuries ago, thousands of years ago, and we rely on people who say that this is how it was, this is the history. Well, how do we know? As it turns out, the ancient Greek historians wrote assuming that their readers were contemporary or not too far ahead in the future, and that they were familiar with the buildings and temples. Therefore, what the Greeks did write about their own structures is often just vague references to them. And when they talked about the measurements and dimensions, it was often just approximations or maybe even guesses. Furthermore, the medieval copyists of these Greek manuscripts, since the Greeks didn't use the same units of measurements, the medieval copyists unfortunately weren't familiar with their terms and units, and so they were largely garbled. So it further hurts the ancient Greek writings. And then, the Romans came in later, and they also wrote about what they saw, but again, it's not nearly as good. But things start to look up in the 1600s when Englishmen and Frenchmen started to make voyages to ancient Greece and Athens and all the other places in Crete. And they started to take down descriptions and make sketches of all these ruins and temples and everything that they saw. And the French Capuchin monks established a monastery in Athens in 1658, and they were largely responsible for sending many hundreds of drawings and descriptions out to the Western world. Because for the time before then, Greek had been controlled by the Ottoman Turks, and so not just anybody could go around, on touring it. Some of the big names of the Englishmen and Frenchmen who went around to ancient Greece were King Charles I, Lord Arundel, and a name that you might have heard, Lord Elgin, and his marbles, which we'll talk about just a bit later. So for the next century, after the 1600s, there are quite a number of books published describing the Greek works. And things really start to get interesting in 1799 when the 7th Earl of Elgin, Thomas Bruce, was suggested by his architect that, instead of just going to ancient Greece and just taking home sketches and descriptions, why not take home some of the actual marbles, some of the architectural features? And Lord Elgin thought that that was a splendid idea, and so he recruited a number of staff and an Italian painter and an architect to assist with the removal of marbles. This is one. Most of them were taken from the Parthenon, and the vast collection eventually came into the possession of the British Museum in 1816. You're probably aware of the controversy of the Elgin marbles. The Greeks today think that they belong not in the British Museum, but in a Greek museum, whereas the British think that, that we've got them first, so they should remain with us. Why there's this controversy is because the Turks, who controlled Greece and all these monuments at the time, made the sale to Lord Elgin. However, the current Greek government says that that sale was illegal. It shouldn't have happened, that essentially Lord Elgin was a vandal, and he just cut out parts of the Parthenon and just shipped them away off to Britain. In the 19th century, which is when we are now in the history, it was mostly just looking at what was up above the ground, the ruins and so on, and excavations didn't start until the middle of the 1800s, again by the Germans and the British and the French. And what's interesting about these excavations is that they uncovered more than just the temples, whose ruins could be plainly seen above the ground, but they uncovered entire Greek cities and other public structures. And so our knowledge of how the Greeks lived and their culture and lifestyle increased magnificently from these excavations, which of course continue to this day. So let's take a look at some more of these Elgin marbles. Here we have a nice a scene from the Parthenon, horse riders. Here we have Lord Elgin himself. Here we have a centaur who appears to be doing battle with a man. And again, here are some more statues which were taken from the Parthenon. So now we will start to talk about the development of Greek architecture. It really begins in the Aegean Age, and as you may know, the geography of Greece, there's mainland Greece, and then there's also the island of Crete. And so there are two distinct cultures that developed in the early days, the islanders on Crete and then the mainlanders. The first structures, of course, were made of wood. They were typically round. It was the simplest sort of thing to build. And then rectangular structures came later as they started to use stone and they had advanced building tools. As early as 2000 BC, they were using wooden columns, and most structural members for houses and so on were wood. And the stone was not used to such a large degree. It was mostly used for foundations. So you didn't have stone columns, but there was some stone features. Of course, houses developed first, and then palaces and temples developed later. Around 1600 to 1400 BC, we start to see the first Greek temples. One example is the Temple of Knossos, which I will show pictures of shortly. And so with these Greek temples, we start to see the beginning of architectural features such as lintels and columns and door openings and wall decorations. Now we see the big temples today, which have their many columns and their arcades and colonnades and so on. But of course, the first temples were nowhere near that complex. They were typically just rectangular structures, and the walls were close enough together that they didn't need a column in the center to support them. However, man is never truly satisfied with one size of building. He always wants something larger, and eventually the Greeks started to run into a problem. The builders were complaining to the architects that, we can't put these walls so far apart because the wooden beams that cross them won't support the weight, and furthermore, where do you find trees that tall? And they're not, so common everywhere. And so the solution, which seems obvious today and probably came to them after not too much thought, was, well, you put columns in the center of the building to support the roof. And the first temples had columns in a single axis, and later on, as temples got even wider, they started to have two axes. So what you had was similar to a large church or cathedral. You have the center aisle, the nave, which is the widest part, and you'd have the altar down at the end. And then you have the two side aisles, which are narrower, closer to the exterior walls. At this time, in the late 700s BC, walls were still generally mud brick, and architectural styles developed slowly to protect these walls from weather and to give a better impression about the impressiveness of the temple. However, no temple yet at this point, around the 700 BCs, had any of the characteristic styles that we typically associate with Greek architecture. However, it's not too much later afterward, in the 600s BC, that we start to see examples of Doric architecture, the Proto-Doric. Columns were originally made out of wood, and then it was noted by archaeologists that as the wood slowly began to decay, it was only then that they started replacing the wood columns with stone. So it wasn't an overnight changeover from wood to stone. It happened naturally, you would say, organically. It's been suggested that the Greek Doric column was influenced based on an imitation of the Greek column, which had lotus leaves at the top. However, it's not entirely sure. Not everyone agrees with that theory. And around the 400s BC, you started to see some of the temples, the walls, instead of being made out of mud brick, instead they were starting to use stone, which was more resistant to the weather. Marble typically, but if marble couldn't be used because it wasn't to be found in the area, they would use limestone, and they'd put a stucco over it so it would resemble marble. Okay, afterward, and we see the Ionic order, which you know is characterized by the scrolls on the top of the columns. The scroll capital is a more better called the volute. It's also thought to have originated based on Egyptian capitals. And one of the reasons for this thought is that Crete had long associations with the Egyptians in trading and things of that nature. Examples of Proto-Ionic capitals are found in temples, and I believe I have a picture here. So this is the scroll, or called the volute, and this is a very early line drawing of one of the capitals. And you can see the difference. If you can, I'll put up another picture of a proper Ionic column, but the main difference between this prototype is that instead of the scrolls just resting on top of the column, as they typically do, they appear to spring forth from the column. And so that's one of the things that the Greeks later refined for the full-formed Ionic order. And by the mid-600s BC, the classical Ionic form seems to have been fully developed from what we can tell based on excavations. Alrighty. So there you have some of the history, and the next part is definitions. So now you can talk to your friends and colleagues about your architectural knowledge. Now this is really great. Here we have the three orders, the Doric order here, Ionic order here, and the Corinthian order here. Now I didn't mention the Corinthian order in my capital because it's the newest order, and it started to come around when the Romans were gaining power and they were becoming the dominant force in Europe. However, the Corinthian style naturally developed from the Ionic. Now, you'll see here that this is the edge of a temple, and it's divided into two main parts, and then each part is divided into smaller parts. And there are so many terms that I'll just cover the basics. So here you have the column, and the column on a Doric only has two parts, but the rest of them have three. So first you have up here is the capital, which is the top, and then here you have the shaft. Now the third part that's missing on the Doric column, which you have on the Ionic and Corinthian, is the base down here. And you'll notice that there are these narrow channels cut into the column for aesthetic effect called flutes. The column supports an entablature, and the entablature is also divided into three parts. Down here, which the part that directly touches the capital is called the architrave, and it was generally, as you can see from these examples, fairly plain. The middle part is called the frieze, and when you see Greek temples and they have those relief carvings of mythological scenes and emperors and everything else, those are typically placed on the frieze, and the top part is called the cornice. Now, as you can see here, it angles upward, and the angle of the roof of the temple is called the rake. And so we'll take a look at a few more terms on the next. On the interiors of buildings, where it wasn't quite so necessary for structural reasons to have a full-blown freestanding column, you typically see instead a pilaster, and it's sort of like a wall meets a column. It's essentially a column that's connected to the wall, and they are typically made just for decorative purposes. They weren't usually structural. Here we have a nice example of some caryatids, which I like to say are columns that are people. And so they are typically female figures, very nicely carved with flowing robes and quite intricate hairstyles. And they're just used to substitute a prettier face, you might say, for columns on temples. And so again, here we have a section of the Parthenon, and you can see, as I was talking about, again, here's the frieze, here's the relief carvings that run along the frieze, the architrave, the cornice, and then at the top there is the rake of the roof. And then here we can see the top part of the column. So again, this is the capital, and then this is the shaft, and then it gets wider as it goes down to the bottom of the column. Now here we have something interesting. This isn't a Greek building, but it's neoclassic, I believe. But the point is, here we have these little square blocks, and they're called dentils. And it happens to come from the Latin word dens for teeth, because they do sort of resemble teeth. The Romans also used dentils, but the thing that differentiates Roman dentils from Greek dentils is that the Greeks were spaced a bit farther apart, whereas the Romans preferred their teeth, I guess, to be closer together. And these dentils are commonly seen on the soffit of the entablature, that is on the underside, as they are seen here. This is very interesting. It was hard to find good photographic examples for this architectural feature, but what we're looking at here is how this part on the top of the chimney piece, or the surround, sticks out a bit, and then it folds in, if you will, and then continues down to the floor. It's called an ear, or the technical term is called an ancone. You'll typically see these around not only just fireplaces, but doorways. They're at the top, and also windows. And sometimes you might see them inside of houses on picture frames for portraits above fireplaces. Here we have another architectural detail, the string course. And also molding, so there's really two things to talk about here. A molding, essentially its purpose is to conceal a joint between two materials or two surfaces. For example, in a room such as this, you might have crown molding that conceals a joint between the ceiling and the wall. You'd have base molding, which we have here, for the joint between the floor and the wall. And likewise here, you have a molding, which happens to be a string course, and it's any horizontal band of a repeated geometric pattern that runs along really any wall. This is called egg and dart. This inside oval shape is the egg, and this little bit in between is the dart. And this is another organic type molding, also string course, whose name I don't recall at the moment. moving along, we get to another structural element called the console, or you might have also heard it termed the corbel, which is this nice S-shaped piece that is supporting a balcony. And then again, you see one right here. It's connected to the wall, and then on top it supports whatever structure is above a balcony, as I said. And these are typically found around doorways, also around windows, and anywhere that there is something above that projected out a bit from the face or the facade of the building. Another common term that you've probably heard a lot is the porch or portico. You probably have one on your house. Well, most Greek temples also had them. Here we have a small temple, and you can see there's the line of columns called the colonnade going on the side and the front. The inside of the temple is right here. This part is outside the temple, but it still has a line of columns in front, and therefore it's called the portico because of its columns that it has. And the last term is the pediment. So here we have the face of a neoclassic building. It's not a Greek temple. But the important part to learn from this is that this triangular feature at the top of the building, which is constituted by the cornice, which I talked about earlier. The cornice is both up here and it's down here too. And then all these carvings and sculptures and statues, it's called the pediment. And in nowadays architecture, such as inside of buildings, you will see pediments above doors and windows. And there are a few different styles of pediments, which the Greeks did not use, but you'll see today. One is the broken pediment, where the apex, the very top of the triangle, is just gone. And then there are also fancier scrolled versions, where instead of just being a straight line, it ends up being a sort of an S-curve. As far as I know, the Greeks did not use those derivatives of the pediment. Those are later creations. Okay. Now let's take a look at some temples and examples of all of this Greek architecture that I've been talking about so far. First off, we'll take a look at the Temple of Hera. The first thing you'll notice about this Greek temple, and you'll notice it about the other photos of temples I show, is that they're not very impressive. They've all fallen down. Unfortunately, because of where Greece is located, it's prone to earthquakes, sort of like California has a number of earthquakes that occur every few hundred years. So as you can tell, this is the Doric order. And the reason why you can tell that is because the columns have no base. They just end right at the bottom there. The capital is rather simple. It's just sort of a bell shape. And then it has the flat block at the top called the abacus. In the back, it was probably a later addition because you can see just barely these scrolls of the Ionic column. So as I said earlier, this is the Temple of Hera, who was the wife of Zeus in classical mythology. It was built around 590 BC. It originally had wood columns, and if you recall earlier when I was talking about the history of the development of Greek architecture, it is quite likely that the wood columns were replaced gradually as they decayed and became unstable with their stone counterparts. And unfortunately, it was destroyed by an earthquake in the 4th century AD, and it was never fully rebuilt. And probably will never be fully rebuilt because it's very likely that not all the stones are still there. Vandals and so on. Okay. Here we have another great Greek temple, which no longer exists. But here we have a rendering of what it might have looked like. This is the famous mausoleum at Halicarnassus, begun by a name that you might recognize, King Mausolus, hence the name mausoleum, before his death in 353 BC. It uses the Ionic order, which we can tell because it has the scrolls at the top of the capital, and then it has the base at the bottom of the column. This was called one of the 7 wonders of the world, and it supposedly was highly detailed, not just on the outside, but also on the inside, though not much of the structure survives today. It's mostly just the foundation and little bits of the columns that were on the bottom stories. As you can see, it's quite tall. It was thought to be 135 feet tall in total. And you can just imagine the sort of engineering effort that it must have taken to lift these huge sculptures all the way to the top there, which must have weighed many tons. Here's what it looks like today. The picture that we saw earlier was just someone's idea of what it might have looked like. And there's not much to write home about, except for that you can see these huge drums. When you have a column in section, it wasn't just one huge piece of marble. It was all sections called drums, and then you can see it better here, the fluting on the sides. And they're all connected with lead bars put in these holes in the center to line them up and for extra stability. Moving along, we have the palace at Knossos. And the photo that you see of it, it's been partially restored. It's hard to believe, but a lot of these ancient structures really were painted. And the reason why we believe that they were painted is because when you dig back through the walls, the archaeologists are able to find very small fragments of pigment and paint. And so based on these small findings, they deduce what it might have looked like and how everything might have been painted. This is Cretan architecture. It's built on the island of Crete. It was probably built between 1700 and 1400 BC, so it was definitely one of the earliest palaces. And you can tell that, again, that it's very early because it has Doric columns. Again, no base, square abacus at the top, and a relatively simple capital. However, it was fairly a good engineering achievement for the time because it was watered by aqueducts. It had drains. It had quite a number of rooms that were used for all sorts of purposes, such as bedrooms, a throne room, storage of food, and all sorts of things. More than 1,000 rooms over 6 acres. So this was definitely a building that was the main religious and governmental center in the area. It would have been well known by many people at the time. And it was first excavated by Arthur Evans in 1900. And as I mentioned earlier, it has to this day been partially restored. And again, what we're looking at here is the north portico of the palace there. Moving along to the final structure that we'll be looking at from the ancient Greek time is the famous Temple of Zeus at Olympia. And the reason why this is famous is because it allegedly held another one of the 7 wonders of the world, the huge statue of Zeus that was apparently a masterwork of gold and carving and all sorts of things. This is a much more modern structure than the palace that we saw just previously. It was built in the mid-400s BC. It was made of limestone and not marble. However, it was stuccoed on the outside to resemble marble. And if you can recall earlier, the reason I said why it probably was made out of limestone and not actual marble is because there was no marble that was located within a convenient distance. There would have been many carvings up here on the pediment and on the frieze that depicted Hercules, for example, the 12 labors of Hercules, and other Greek mythological stories. Unfortunately, it was another earthquake victim. It seemed like just about every temple fell down to an earthquake in the 500s AD, so it lasted just about a millennia until time took it. Thorough excavation of this temple commenced in 1875 and continues to this day, and we'll take a look at what it looks like today. Actually, no, sorry. We'll take a look at one of the carvings, and here we have Hercules, or what's left of him, and he appears to be wrestling with a bull. All right, finally, let's move on to the last part of my presentation today, which is Greek architecture in our own modern times, which is from the 19th century up till today. We start with neoclassicism. Neoclassicism began in the 1700s in France and in Europe and other countries in Europe, and essentially what it was in response to the thought that the architects of the day were getting too wild and fantastic. For example, there was Baroque architecture, which was highly ornate. There were all these sorts of architectures which these architects thought were just way too over the top, and they felt that they had corrupted the nicely balanced mathematical classical orders, and so they sought to revive the classic architecture of both the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks. And as you may know from your American history, it was essentially the official architecture of the United States in its founding years. And then here we have, of course, the U.S. Capitol building, which has so many architectural features. We have a colonnade here. Of course, we have the whole entablature, the architrave, the frieze, the cornice. Anything above the cornice is called the attic. It's not always an interior room such as the attic in a house. And then we have, I don't know if you can see them very well, but at the tops of these windows we have consoles or corbel, which supports, again, a pediment above each window here. Pilasters, they're not structural at all, they're just to look nice. And there's quite a lot more, but that's enough for now. And out of neoclassicism, we also have a brother or sister style you might call Greek revival. This looks like it could have come right out of ancient Greece. It survived all the earthquakes, but it was actually built much later. So the Greek revival style really picked up in the 1700s and 1800s, and the main engine behind Greek revival in the U.S. was none other than Thomas Jefferson. He was the one largely responsible for advocating the style, and he also designed a number of buildings, such as his house Monticello, using the Greek revival style. And of course, the style was also quite popular with the plantation houses in the South. And so what we have here is the Second Bank of the United States in Philadelphia. And again, hopefully you're picking up on some of these terms. So we have the large triangle structure, which is the pediment at the top. The pediment is outlined, if you will, by the cornice, and this is also the cornice. Then here in the middle, you have the frieze, the architrave. This whole three-piece is called the entablature. Again, at the top of the columns, we have the abacus, the capital, the shaft of the column, which is fluted, and because it's from the Doric order, there's no base. The bottom of the column just sits on whatever is below it. And that's all I have to say on that. So, thank you for your time.
This building that was colored, can we go back to the slide where you have this temple that's colored?
Oh, yes.
Did you say this was intact, found intact, buried, or restructured, rebuilt?
It was found relatively intact insofar as the foundations and everything, though large parts of it were rebuilt. For example, the part of the portico here, these columns very unlikely would have still been standing upright over the centuries. So what the archaeologists had to work with were largely the foundations and then the parts of the stones which were scattered all around the buildings in the many photos that I showed. And they pieced them together and they painted them based on how they probably would have looked like.
Are there any writings that explained or described this so that imagination would be, or just this is mere imagination of 21st, 20th century something?
I think it's pretty safe to say that the wall paintings were largely imagined. There probably would have been some wall painting, though it's very unlikely that it would have been this depiction that we have there. Because again, even though the ancient Greek writers mentioned these buildings and they referred to them and talked about them, they assumed that the average Joe Greek in the street could visit these and was already himself fairly familiar with them.
Okay. Can we go also to the other mausoleum or the big burial place of this one here?
Yes.
Anybody describe this in literature so they can imagine how tall, how big, how it looks like, or just imagination of somebody?
Well, as one of the seven wonders of the world, it was, of course, rather well known in Greece and abroad. So I think it's very likely that there are classical descriptions of it. And it wasn't destroyed until, much later. So there definitely would have been time for many people to see it and write about it or even tell others about it. So the oral tradition would have been passed down through history.
Excellent. Sorry to take the questions first, but if you have any other questions that you would like to...
Well, one thing I just would like to say that the Palace of Knossos is all imagination. That's been completely discredited, what Arthur Evans did. The Palace of Knossos, as reconstructed by Arthur Evans, is pretty much all imagination. It's been discredited. He tried to create a civilization he called Minoan there, and he wanted to sell things that looked like it. He had his workers make objects that they sold as real, and they were forgeries. And so that's, you have to be very careful about Knossos.
So
and also
research.
Halicarnassus, this is not Greek, This is in Asia Minor. It's a Persian governor whose wife who built this as his mausoleum, which is where we get the term. This is Hellenistic period. So you jumped from pre-Greek with Knossos, or from this, which is Hellenistic, back to pre-Greek, which is Knossos. And really, that's Aegean, and this is Hellenistic. So you're taking you took a very wide view. Anyway, you came all the way up to the 20th century. I mean, it was great. But you have to be careful about your chronology and knowing which is actually Greek and which isn't.
All right, thank you.
Very good. When you compare these to the ancient Egyptian things, what helped, as far as I know, in Egypt, is that many of these temples stand as they stood all these years. They've never been down and rebuilt. It has always been there. So we can have a good idea of what the Ramesses and other Karnak and others, because they are as they left them. Not the case here.
No. Knossos was already destroyed before the Greeks would ever had a chance to see it. It was destroyed in 1200 by the Mycenaeans, so they wouldn't have been able to go visit and see, like you were saying, it wasn't there anymore.
Just a question. What is the secret of fascination with the pediment thing? You find it in Washington, you find it in New York, you find it everywhere. Even wherever you go, you find this pediment. Even in the head of the bed, you have it. You have it in the houses. You have it. Why is this fascination of it? Not a curvature, not an elliptical, but this triangle, the magic triangle.
Well, I've got a microphone. Well, of course, it's sort of obvious at first because there has to be some sort of triangular figure, element to the building because the rake of the roof. So I would suspect, I didn't get into too much of it from my reading, that it was treated as another area of the building where they could put carvings and reliefs and so on.
You don't see much in ancient Egypt, but you find it in ancient Greece and Romans and so forth, going from that Hellenistic.
The Romans took it on as a symbol of a sacred building, of divinity, and they added behind their emperors to indicate that, and the arch comes from Persia, suggesting the arch of the heavens, so they combine it. That's why it comes so much into neoclassical.
Dr. Woodley, you have been around the world in many places. Have you seen effects of this Hellenistic or Greek thing in the places you went, China, wherever?
I tend to go to rural communities, so I haven't seen a lot. My last trip was to Antarctica, and they didn't have any buildings. So not really where I've chosen to go.
Even the when you go in Washington, for example, you find even the modern buildings this effect. Have you seen that wherever you went?
Well, in the United States, yes. I think the other thing that where I've traveled has been Germany and France, and there are more of the Romanesque type things and the arches, the flying buttresses, the arches, those types of things.
Thank you. Anything else? Do you have anything to add to this interesting?
I had an old house, and I called it Victorian. Now, where does that come from? It had some columns and stuff in it.
It comes from the reign of Queen Victoria in England.
Is it?
And it was, I think, you'll find it was the British had an obsession with all sorts of decoration. And so that's where you got all the intricate carvings and rosette blocks and all sorts of things like that in houses.
Say the question again, please. So I have
Oh, I owned an old house, and they called it Victorian style, and had columns and some of the roof stuff on it and all. That's what I wondered about.
Very good. Anything else you want to tell us that comes in the spirit of a moment?
No, I don't think so.
You said very well. So please give him a round of applause, and thank you very much.
Ancient Greek writings. And then, the Romans came in later, and they also wrote about what they saw, but again, it's not nearly as good. But things start to look up in the 1600s when Englishmen and Frenchmen started to make voyages to ancient Greece and Athens and all the other places in Crete. And they started to take down descriptions and make sketches of all these ruins and temples and everything that they saw. And the French Capuchin monks established a monastery in Athens in 1658, and they were largely responsible for sending many hundreds of drawings and descriptions out to the Western world. Because for the time before then, Greek had been controlled by the Ottoman Turks, and so not just anybody could go around, on touring it. Some of the big names of the Englishmen and Frenchmen who went around to ancient Greece were King Charles I, Lord Arundel, and a name that you might have heard, Lord Elgin, and his marbles, which we'll talk about just a bit later. So for the next century, and then the third book was The Architecture of Ancient Greece by William B. Dinsmore. And so those were the three books that I relied on the most in preparing this presentation. Now, to start off, let's talk about the history, because obviously all this stuff was built many centuries ago, thousands of years ago, and we rely on people who say that this is how it was, this is the history. Well, how do we know? As it turns out, the ancient Greek historians wrote assuming that their readers were contemporary or not too far ahead in the future, and that they were familiar with the buildings and temples. Therefore, what the Greeks did write about their own structures is often just vague references to them. And when they talked about the measurements and dimensions, it was often just approximations or maybe even guesses. Furthermore, the medieval copyists of these Greek manuscripts, since the Greeks didn't use the same units of measurements, the medieval copyists unfortunately weren't familiar with their terms and units, and so they were largely garbled. So it further hurts the century. After the 1600s, there are quite a number of books published describing the Greek works. And things really start to get interesting in 1799 when the 7th Earl of Elgin, Thomas Bruce, was suggested by his architect that, instead of just going to ancient Greece and just taking home sketches and descriptions, why not take home some of the actual marbles, some of the architectural features? And Lord Elgin thought that that was a splendid idea, and so he recruited a number of staff and an Italian painter and an architect to assist with the removal of marbles this is one. Most of them were taken from the Parthenon, and the vast collection eventually came into the possession of the British Museum in 1816. You're probably aware of the controversy of the Elgin marbles. The Greeks today think that they belong not in the British Museum, but in a Greek museum, whereas the British think that, that we've got them first, so they should remain with us. Why there's this controversy is because
Soon.
Yes.
You'll love his research, and without much ado, here is David.
Thank you. All right. Today's topic is ancient Greek architecture, and just a brief outline of what I'm going to cover, because it's such a broad subject area. I decided to focus on first the history. Then we're going to talk about a number of architectural terms for the forms and features. Then a few examples of Greek temples and palaces. And then finally, I'll talk about how Greek architecture is still around us today in neoclassicism and the Greek revival styles. I had a lot of success with researching the material for this from 3 books that I found from the library here. And the first one was Classical Architecture, The Poetics of Order by Alexander Zonis and Leon Lefebvre. That really helped out with a lot of the temples and palaces, and it had a lot of pictures. And a lot of the history came from the book called Classical Architecture by James S. Curl.
Well, good morning. I think all of you in the audience today have been here to previous sessions, so we welcome you back to the next exciting talk. This time we're having one of our graduate students here at Eastern present on architecture, and I will want to thank him for his work by presenting him with the certificate here.
Thank you.
David Finnigan, and I also want to congratulate you on the recent publication of your book
Yes.
on computers. So I will ask Dr. Wabi to present, I think, his student.
Thank you all for coming. Actually, David Finnigan is one of my best students. He is a thorough researcher, and he is an author, also published author. And I don't know if you're still undergraduate, right?
Yes, still
So
undergraduate.
next year you'll be graduate, and we'll look for Dr. Finnigan's